So I am going to pass it off. Alana Frank, who is our CEO and founder, will get us started. But just thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Elisheva. So like many of you, infertility is personal to me. And as a result, I was able to start the organization almost 10 years ago. So now JFF is 9 years strong. We began to support intended parents on their path to parenthood. And today we are a national organization which provides financial assistance, emotional support, and educational resources like this evening's event, a post-Roe world, education and advocacy around fertility access. I want to make sure to thank our partners, the Jewish Women's Fund of Atlanta and the National Council of Jewish Women, and of course, Elisheva for organizing tonight's event. Thank you.
All right, so we are going to kick it off. So to begin, we are actually going to, excuse me, we are actually going to have our first round of panelists, and I would very excited to welcome AshLeigh Dunham. So she is going to be speaking on the what happened in Alabama, why we're all here, how this all started. So AshLeigh, thank you for being here, and take it away.
Perfect. Well, I actually first saw this case when it started, and I saw it pop up in my newsfeed. And I was like, this is going to be terrible. I can see what's going to happen from this. I see it happening in almost, it was slow motion, but essentially what happened was there was a patient in a hospital in Mobile, Alabama, who stumbled upon a door that had been propped open and left open. And that patient went into what our Alabama Supreme Court later on termed a cryogenic nursery, went to a lab, picked up a frozen, where embryos had been frozen. And when they went in to go grab the tubes inside, they froze their hands and dropped them. And at that point, the embryos arrested. They were destroyed. And this was in, like I said, December of 2020. So at that time, there were 3 couples who were impacted. Those 3 different couples, they never really joined forces, so to say, but they were, 2 of the couples had 1 attorney and 1 couple had a 3rd attorney. The 2 couples, they had asserted certain rights. So this part is kind of important. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but they asserted a wrongful death of a minor act. So all 3 of them did, but these only did a wrongful death of a minor and then negligence. And then the 3rd couple also added what is called a bailment claim, which is a destruction of property and a breach of contract, which goes into additional areas of law. But all 3 were operating under just the wrongful death of a minor act, and they went in front of the circuit court in Mobile. And so in Mobile, the judge down in lower Alabama said, okay, well, I don't think this can be a wrongful death case because embryos are not considered a life. We're not going that. We're not going to say that they are. And at that point, their case was dismissed altogether. They then went to the Alabama Supreme Court. The Alabama Supreme Court said, no, let us look at this. And they ran with it, and things went south. So essentially, and I won't go too far into it, but if you want a very detailed description of what happened, I can give that to you at a different time, but I'm trying to fit everybody in. So let me just kind of explain what the Chief Justice the Justice who wrote the opinion, the main opinion said. And what he said was, we have to worry about this because this wrongful death of a minor act should apply no matter where the location of the life is. From the moment of conception, all life is precious. And so we have to protect it. And he does go into, at one point, he mentions an artificial womb and says, we don't need to say that it needs to be in utero, because what about this scientific thing that I read? And he quotes some article talking about an artificial womb and how one day it may be possible to grow babies outside of the womb, and just kind of touches on that and then moves along. He goes through an entire slew of cases and says how all these cases allow the Supreme Court kind of expanded what the protections were to lie when there is when a person is given protection. So like there was one where I said, like, if you had a child in utero, you had to let that child breathe. And if that child were to have one breath, then that child would be protected. And then they said, never mind, once you get to viability, that child will be protected. What he fails to mention is how the legislature was expanding before each of those cases to allow them to expand that. But he doesn't really go into that. He just says, hey, life is precious. We're going to go with that. To go kind of long story short, the other justices basically say the same thing. They say, well, this is really for the legislature to decide, but we agree we want to protect life. So we're going to go with that statute back from 1872, the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act, and we're going to protect life at conception, and we're going forward with this. Now, it's funny because when you look at the other opinions, they basically say in here, hey, there's no distinction between in utero, not in utero. And then you hear other people say, well, I'm not quite sure that, IVF didn't exist back then, but we're still going to go with it. And then our Chief Justice, he went on a very, very long, I wouldn't say diatribe, but that's almost how I would go with it. Diatribe. He was basically up at the altar, and he's quoting the Bible, and I think he just wanted to make a point at that point. So it was just a very long opinion on his side. That's basically the sanctity of life, and he uses it going from there. And that's about as much as I'll say on that. The most important part of the entire opinion came from the dissent, in my opinion, even though, because I guess he doesn't agree with them. I personally also was like, hey, wait. So in the dissent, they do talk about all the other states. And they say, and he says it was essentially, Justice Cook goes through and says, you know what? No other state has ever ruled that embryos are children. This was for the legislature to do. This is not our job. We need to look at the original meaning of the law that was passed in 1872. And then he goes through and he gives a full outline of every single case. And he says, the difference is the legislature was expanding what we could protect by like the Brody Act. And he talks about the different ways they expanded it. And he was like, we cannot do this as the court. We are stepping outside of our checks and balances. So after that was done, they then said, okay, since an embryo is life, they sent it back down. So they sent it back down to the Mobile court in Alabama for them to then rule on that, that motion to dismiss. They said, hey, you can't dismiss their case because an embryo is a life. So they send it back down. So now, as it's going back down, we in Alabama said we will not take it. So we all went down and we decided to go educate our legislators and talk to them, and got that stopgap Band-Aid legislation done as quickly as possible. And there was that legislation that came through, the immunity statute. So we had that passed. So basically what happened is, as it's going back down to the Mobile Circuit Court, that statute comes in and takes their case away again. And so those three couples are down here, and it gets back to the Mobile Circuit Court, and the court says, all right, let's hear your case. And, basically, I told you didn't have a case, but let's hear it. And now they're saying, okay, well, now you took away our chance at having a case. So the three couples say, okay, you can't do that because we already filed our case. This statute's now unconstitutional because the Supreme Court told y'all that that an embryo is a life. You cannot now pass legislation that says that an embryo, that you can do something that is not compatible with protecting the sanctity of life. So you can't now say that IVF is okay and give immunity. So here we are with those three couples saying, no, no, no. And then two of the three couples said, wait a minute, you know what? We're good. And they step out. So that's my simplistic way of saying. So they settle outside of court. The third couple is still waiting to overturn the statute that we have that protected IVF. In the meantime, the medical association says, well, you know what? We the whole time have been saying that this third couple they don't have standing to bring this lawsuit. Now, standing in a lawsuit basically is, are you the one that's injured in such a manner that you can bring this suit? Because the third couple actually signed clinic paperwork that said after 5 years, destroy our embryos. So the medical association says, well, you can't now bring this lawsuit because you already gave them the permission to do it. You can't now say you destroyed my embryo. You don't have standing to bring this lawsuit. So they then said, since the Alabama Supreme Court wouldn't touch this, they didn't do their job, essentially. Not saying that's what but that they said, hey, you didn't consider a constitutional issue. So that couple says, stop the case again, stop it. We're going to the big guys. So send it up to SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States. So they've now petitioned the Supreme Court of the United States of America. So now they were supposed to respond. So when I say the couple was supposed to respond to the SCOTUS petition. So they were supposed to respond and say what their case is or what their response is to this. And instead they responded with I'm not going to dignify that with a response, essentially. So they basically said, we don't think that you have a case, so we're not going to respond unless the Supreme Court decides to, on a crazy chance, take this case and wants to hear it. And at that point, we'll respond. And that's where we stand right now. And so at this point, either SCOTUS could hear it and demand a response, and then it goes to the Supreme Court of the United States, which could impact everybody, or they could say, we're good, we're not going to hear this case, this is an Alabama problem, and they send it back down, and then that stopgap or that Band-Aid statute that we got passed is at risk again.
Thank you, AshLeigh.
Fastest way I could explain it.
Yeah, I know it's a lot. I know, trying to pack in a lot of information. So thank you so much. It's a really great way to kind of frame where we are right now, but kind of like on what happened. So just for people who have come in while AshLeigh was speaking, just that you know, because we're in a webinar setting, please feel free to submit questions. There is a Q&A function. So not the chat, but it's actually a Q&A. Please feel free to submit questions that you would like to ask the panelists, and I'm happy to pass those along to them. So, so AshLeigh, thank you so much. So we are going to move on. So Nikki, Mirova, and Ilya Mirov would like to introduce them right now. They are a couple from Alabama who have a very interesting story. So I will pass it on to them.
Hello, everyone. Well, this is just about our IVF story. So we started to think about having kids a little bit later in life. We were in our early 30s, and we had been focusing on education and our professional careers. And we had no idea that we'd be facing any kind of fertility issues. We just thought everything would go as normal. And we were trying to have kids the normal way for about 2 years without any success.
When we did find out we were now fertility patients, we had no accurate expectations of how trying the whole process would be. I, for one, thought it would be, kind of quick. They have so much technology now, they can just help us have a baby, everything will be fine. But everything took so much longer than we expected. There wasn't really any support out there financially. Insurance covered nothing as far as the costs, which are extensive if you've been through the process. And with lost time from work and things like that, you're also taking time off work very unexpectedly. Sometimes you don't know when it will be until a day or two before, so it's not something you can plan ahead for very well. And I needed a lot of lab tests, both of us. I actually needed a surgery and some waiting time after that. There were a lot of trials, trying things, waiting again, and healing. And in the end of our first round that we used almost all of our savings to complete, we didn't have any viable embryos. So we were kind of stuck choosing whether we wanted to abandon the whole process or try again. I'll let you know.
Yeah, and so as Nikki just mentioned, after our first round, our savings were almost completely gone. But we really wanted to have a baby. So we said, well, we're going to put the deposit down on round 2. We have to try again. So that's where we were. And just a week before we were supposed to begin taking medicines for stimulation, the Supreme Court decision, the Alabama Supreme Court decision, comes down in the news, and we're just devastated. We feel so helpless, and it feels like we're running out of time. So this resets everything all over again, because now we realize that that what we had signed up for is surely going to be canceled.
And it was around that time we found out about the Jewish Fertility Foundation, and we saw a lot in reading about the process and their programs that they were associated with a lot of clinics and people in Atlanta. And so when we applied and were very graciously receiving a grant from them to help us with our second round, we also moved our treatment completely over to Atlanta, because when the Supreme Court decision came out, we didn't get any information. There was no call from our doctor to tell us they were holding everything. We just saw it on the news. We got a portal message a few days later saying treatment was on hold, and they didn't know how long it would be on hold. Mm-hmm. So we were wondering, will they even do our egg retrieval in Alabama anymore? Will they fertilize our eggs if we get them? Will they try to charge us with some kind of crime if anything happens? If we have frozen embryos, will we be able to do anything with them or move them to another state if we need to? And since we didn't have any frozen in Alabama then, we decided we didn't want to in the future if this is how things were going to be.
Yeah. And we basically came together and decided that we're not going to let any of these external forces dictate how our fertility journey is going to end. So we moved to Atlanta, the ASRM clinic in Atlanta, and our first meeting with our doctor gave us a lot of hope that round 2 is going to be different. And of course, we applied to the Jewish Fertility Foundation and found out we had the grant, and we're working closely with our doctor in Atlanta, and we're moving back and forth to all of these appointments. For example, mere days before, actually the day before, we were supposed to have a surprise in-person meeting in Atlanta with our doctor, with our team. We found out the day before, and we had to cancel plans to go to a wedding of a dear friend. So instead, we got rushed to the car, figured out how we were going to get there, managed to stay with her cousin for a day as we had this meeting with the team, and thankfully everything went well.
And when you hear people might need to move to another state for care, it doesn't sound that inconvenient, but in reality, it very much is. There's trying to find a place to stay once every month or twice a month, and toward the end of the process, once every few days when you need to go in for appointments. And getting vacation from work, if you can sometimes be difficult, because you only get 2 weeks a year, and you might use it all up in one round of IVF treatment. I was lucky. We have some family in Atlanta that let me stay with them, and I work remotely, and so does my husband.
Yeah.
I think just a normal person working in person might not even be able to do what we did.
Yeah, as my wife said, she works completely remotely, and I was a hybrid at the time, and between that and taking time off work at critical periods, we were able to make it work, but it was probably impossible for a regular couple with regular jobs to do it. But having said all that, we received the amazing news after our egg retrieval. We got 7 eggs, and then a few weeks after that, we found out that 5 are viable and perfectly healthy, and now we're pregnant with one of those embryos.
Yes, she'll be due in March. We're very much looking forward to it.
So we're overjoyed with that success, but we're also extremely saddened by the growing barriers that women and families are now facing when they're seeking family planning and fertility treatment.
So I really appreciate the Jewish Fertility Foundation and their partners for all the help they're giving people like us.
Yes, we're very grateful. that's all we have. Thank you.
Wow. Well, I have heard your story before and it still gives me the goosebumps. So thank you so much for sharing. I can't even imagine what that must have been like for you. And we're so grateful for you both, for your wonderful news and for being here, obviously. And we're so thrilled that this did not, well, it was probably a little bit of a bump in the road. We're just so glad that you found such a wonderful ending to this craziness. So thank you so much. So I would like to pass on our next speakers. Very excited to introduce Jessie Losch from the American Society of Reproductive Medicine and Smriti Krishnan from the National Council of Jewish Women.
Thank you, AshLeigh, and Mazel Tov, Nikki and Ilya. I'm going to test my tech skills here and see if I could I cannot, it does not let me share my screen, but that's okay because I took improv in college, so we're good. So as AshLeigh said, I'm Jessie Losch. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Government Affairs Manager for the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. We are a national organization. We represent reproductive medicine providers. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what we've been hearing from our members across the country. Oh, that's me. That's not my screen. Okay, from our members across the country. After the Alabama decision, and Smriti and then Betsy, I know we're going to get a little bit more into sort of the current landscape. So I'm going to pull my slides up on my end just so I can quote to you some direct quotes from our docs. So Alabama, as AshLeigh mentioned, was sort of for those of us who have been ensconced in this reproductive landscape for a while, was I think less of a surprise than maybe it should have been. You know, we have seen a number of legal and legislative challenges to medical and physical autonomy. And then when you sort of narrow that down to reproductive and sexual autonomy, it's been pretty devastating. So since 2022, we, of course, had the Dobbs decision that dismantled the protections of Roe v. Wade. We had FDA versus Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine challenging some of the medications used in abortion and miscarriage management. And then sort of, you know, really quickly, we saw this LePage decision that AshLeigh really, that was like a crash course in however many sentences. It was really good. And then we also saw Idaho versus the United States, which challenged this issue of life or health of the pregnant person. So if you hear about EMTALA, emergency medical treatments, that was challenged in Idaho. And we saw, as Betsy will talk about, personhood measures introduced in 34 states. So 34 states attempted to define a person as beginning at the moment of either conception or fertilization. On top of that, getting even narrower. So it's federal, we went to state, and then we saw these so-called, in their own words, sanctuary city for the unborn ordinances. So those are town and city ordinances that, again, define person as beginning at the moment of conception and take place within those sort of local limits. Oh, it's a good thing I'm not showing you this slide because it's overwhelming. It just shows you how many bills that we're
We
tracking.
actually do see the slides now.
We do.
We do.
Yeah, Jessie.
Amazing.
Yes, we are able to show yours. So yes, overwhelming, but in a good way, I think. So yes, please
That's
keep going.
fabulous.
It's
Okay,
great.
can I move them? Oh, beautiful. Look at that. Okay, so you don't need to know this. That's just a lot. So we're tracking all of these things in a number of ways. All of these bills could impact IVF and fertility. And then I'm pressing like I'm moving the slides. That's great. Okay, so aside from that, aside from sort of traditional personhood legislation, this idea of personhood can kind of hide in a nefarious ways. So in sex education bans, we saw, I think, 13 states mandate that human growth education or sex education teach that life begins at the moment of conception. We saw these economic boycott bills. I never wanted to talk about economics or insurance in my entire life, but then you realize that these are economic boycott bills that would would mandate that a town, city, or state could not do business with providers of abortion, or in some cases, IVF. There are so-called abortion trafficking bans, and this has really deep implications on embryos because the abortion trafficking bans or bans on practical support would criminalize, and again, I'm using the language of the bills and laws themselves, would criminalize taking a minor out of state. And in a place like Alabama that defines a minor child as beginning a conception, that has really deep implications on shipping your embryos into or out of a state. Child support bills that would mandate that somebody begin paying child support at conception. Talk to me about how that would work. I don't know. Parents' Bill of Rights bills that, again, some of these, so the draft bills of these would also mandate that children cannot learn anything but life beginning at conception. And then medical records. So this is, about data privacy and personal privacy. And so if somebody, has embryos stored in one state, the possibility that somebody could subpoena their medical records and see that would be pretty high. So these were all bills that were introduced. Most of them did not pass. And then if we could go down, thank you. So we sent a survey to our doctors, I think 3 days after the LePage decision, asking, how have you been affected by these restrictions? What's going on? And you could see that the number one answer that they gave us was that their patients are more anxious. They noticed right away. But then also, similarly to what you all have said so far, they were really uncertain of what they could legally provide or say. So I will say that our office, and we are a policy office, we do not provide legal advice, but our office was bombarded with calls from everywhere from Alabama to Pennsylvania asking about criminalization. If I counsel my patients that they should think about discarding their embryos, will they be criminalized? Will I be criminalized? If my staff, lives in West Virginia but works in Virginia, could they be arrested on one side of the border on the way home? And then you see that in my staff is anxious. A few of our docs said that it's changed what they said or provided to their patients. And then we had a whole host of others, which again talked about this topic of sort of uncertainty and anxiety. So I pulled a couple of their direct quotes just to show you the breadth of what we were seeing. Patients are very concerned about the safety of their embryos. A small number of patients are so concerned about being a pregnant person in this country at present that they have stopped treatment and stopped trying to conceive. So these were all anonymized, but our members could tell us where they lived or practiced. So we are sort of seeing this on a geographic level. But I will say that this really was national. I think the implications of LePage were felt no matter where our members lived or practiced. We're more reluctant to send specimens to long-term storage facilities in other states. Patients are concerned about storing embryos in our state after the recent election and concerned about their medical care during pregnancy. Some are considering going out of state for medical care. And as Nikki and Ilya said, some are considering moving out of state. It has caused increased concern at all levels about potential future legal liability for performing IVF procedures. This, again, I think, we see in a lot of healthcare, with a cross-state practice being via telehealth, I'm having to check state regulations and laws before conducting a consultation. And then there are a handful of more on the next few slides, but I think, yeah, so, again, relocating cryopreserved embryos, trying to anticipate what patients can and cannot do. We're trying to think about what could possibly happen. AshLeigh said this happened on a Friday. So you see that our members are trying to sort of think, what could change in the next few days? And how will that change what I tell my patients? How will that change, what we're able to provide? Patients are changing their protocol for IVF retrievals because they're afraid of making too many embryos. And as you see here, patients are paying thousands of dollars to ensure pregnancy, but if they fear punitive action for having too many embryos, they may also never get a family, a basic human right. And then the next slide just has a couple more. about gestational carriers. There's so much uncertainty. Patients are scared for the future. They don't deserve to have added stress. And then I thought this last one was really important. The politicizing of reproductive health makes it difficult to provide quality care and education. I will say one that stuck out, and I spoke to this incredible doctor today. She has been practicing in Idaho for 35 years. She is the chief of their practice. She said they have never had trouble filling a fellowship position until this year, when suddenly what they're hearing is that medical students, residents, and fellows are afraid to live in and practice in Idaho. So when we hear about these laws and we hear about these decisions, I think the trickle-down factor is really going to affect everybody. You know, there are already reproductive healthcare deserts. Those are just going to get deeper and wider. Our doctors are really anxious. Some of their staff members have left the practice because they are concerned, they are scared. And I think our doctors are really worried about their patients in sort of new and frightening ways, you know, not just maybe this transfer won't happen, but what happens to my patients if they have to take a bridge to the next state to go home? So I know that Smriti and Betsy are going to get a little bit more into that, but that's me. You know, reach out at any time, and I just want to thank Alana and AshLeigh for really giving us this opportunity to put a spotlight on this.
Thank you so much, Jessie. Really appreciate that. I'd like to introduce Smriti Krishnan, who is speaking on behalf of the National Council of Jewish Women, one of our partners for this wonderful event. And Smriti, we'll go ahead and share your slides for you, just to avoid any technical difficulties.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. As AshLeigh said, my name is Smriti Krishnan. I serve as National Council of Jewish Women's Legislative Council. My pronouns are she, hers. Congratulations. It was a wonderful, happy ending, and I'm very glad we got to hear the story right off at the beginning of the presentation for some positive setting the stage there. As Jessie got more into the policy, I will also be delving a bit more into the policy aspect. But before delving into that, I wanted to give a little bit of introduction about National Council of Jewish Women, or shorthand is NCJW. We are a 130-year-old organization, and we strive to improve the lives of women, children, and families. I believe that's on the next slide, if you don't mind, Kayla. Thank you so much. We are a 130-year-old organization, and we have 210,000 advocates across the country and 50 local sections, as well as a national office, all combining education, direct service, and advocacy so that we can create social change at local, state, and national levels. And there's a neat graphic I just wanted to show on the next slide with the numbers there. And next slide, please, Kayla. One thing very unique about NCJW is that we draw guidance from Jewish values in the framing of our work. So things like respect and dignity. We draw on those values to guide our work in reproductive rights, justice, and healthcare. And so I think it's very, very important that we emphasize the narrative that people of faith want abortion access and access to a full spectrum of safe reproductive healthcare like IVF access. And so the importance of this narrative cannot be overstated, particularly in today's time. We see often the counter narrative that folks of faith don't want access to a full spectrum of safe reproductive health care. And we actively work to change that narrative. And I'm very, very glad that I can be here today with all of you to share the importance of that narrative and how NCJW approaches this work. I approach it with respect, and I approach it especially by centering the people who have been most impacted by the lack of access to reproductive health care, reproductive rights, particularly since the Dobbs ruling. So as we know, the Dobbs ruling happened June 24th, 2022. And it was a ruling that reproductive rights advocates have been fearing for decades. And when it came down, there was a massive abrupt change. While there were definitely restrictions on access to reproductive health care prior to the ruling, there were more emboldened attacks on reproductive rights and healthcare across our country. So immediately we saw the seizing of operations of some clinics. We saw an increase in health telehealth services and medication abortion. We also saw this emergence of patchwork of state laws affecting reproductive health care access. So it was confusing for people trying to seek access to reproductive health care that they needed and they wanted. And we also saw a lot of confusion and chaos about accessing abortion, providing abortion, how folks could cross state lines to obtain abortions. And we saw private rights of actions for citizen suits against patients, including folks who were seeking out-of-state care, and against providers and individuals who helped others access abortion and reproductive rights health care. And the impact of Dobbs has continued into today. We saw several weeks ago the example out of Louisiana where there was a reclassification of misoprostol and mifepristone, the two drug regimen that makes up medication abortion. This is so important because after the Dobbs ruling, individuals have been using medication abortion as a way to safely access abortion. And those misoprostol and mifepristone were classified as a crime by 1 to 5 years in prison and fines of up to $5,000 if there's an unprescribed possession. Now, on the flip side, we also saw protections for abortion care. So we saw protections being increased. Sorry, Kaylee, I'm still in the prior, so apologies for that. We saw protections for abortion care be increased by several states. Presently, it's about legal in 25 states and in DC. And some of these states have enacted new protections for abortion care, and they've also enshrined the rights to abortion in the state's constitution. And you'll hear me talking a lot about abortion at the beginning of my presentation, but I promise you there's a connection to IVF and it's coming. And so we also today see ballot measures happening around the country where folks have the chance to express their opinions about abortion. And I also want to say towards the start of my presentation that I'm speaking about this all in a 501c3 manner. Then we also have seen states put up laws that shield abortion providers as well. Guttmacher Institute, I think, has a very interesting statistic here that there was 11% increase in clinician-provided abortions between 2020 and 2023. So that's reflecting a longer-term increase in abortion access or abortion that started after 2017. But that statistic doesn't mean that everyone who needed an abortion was to get one. We also saw the impact on maternal health and mental health. We saw the case coming out of Texas, Zurowski versus Texas, where several plaintiffs shared their very, very personal stories about how they were forced to carry and the devastating impact it had on their mental health and their maternal health. So there are very long-reaching consequences for the Dobbs ruling in many aspects of our healthcare system. You would also have noticed that there's an increased visibility in the public sphere for reproductive rights, healthcare, and justice. It seems like everyone is talking about that today. This is not to say that the work was not happening for decades prior to the Dobbs ruling, but since the couple of years, 2.5 years that the ruling has come down, we definitely have seen that increased visibility in the national forum there. Next slide, please, Kayla. Thank you. So there are also threats to reproductive rights, healthcare, and justice, including IVF. So we see a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there. This misinformation, disinformation applies to crisis pregnancy centers or anti-abortion centers where folks are not given the accurate information that they would need in their decision-making process. We also see legislators and individuals mislabeling things like birth control pills or contraception as ways of accessing abortion. There definitely have been instances in states such as Missouri where an attempt to have birth control or right to contraception in the bill did not go through the legislature. We also saw that at the federal level back in June when the right to contraception bill did not pass the Senate. And the dynamics of the states here are also really important. When we think about the coalitions, we think about partnerships, and we think about how the work is getting done on the ground to even be able to ensure that people have access to things like contraception, birth control, IVF access to abortion, and the whole full spectrum of safe reproductive health care. Next slide, please. So now, AshLeigh gave this really detailed view of, I think, a really wonderful, strong view of the IVF case. And just to share a little bit, the IVF case, when I saw the ruling back in February, this was you know, it had a personal impact on me because Alabama was home for me. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. I did all my schooling there. And after the case came down, the ruling came down, I had classmates posting about their personal experiences. And you heard the very powerful story that was just shared a few minutes back. And so I want to go really focus on the impact that this had on everyone trying to access IVF in Alabama after this happened. There was chaos. There was confusion. There were folks trying to access IVF. It had to be abruptly stopped. Again, I had classmates sharing their personal stories on social media, trying to fundraise so that they could move embryos across state lines. So the toll that it takes on an individual is immense. The financial strain, the emotional strain, the uncertainty, and there's also the long-term impact, right? The Alabama legislature did pass that immunity law, but it took 18 days to pass. 18 days. That's almost 3 weeks. That's 3 weeks of facing uncertainty, of facing financial pressures, of trying to reconfigure one's life, one's career, one's other family commitments, other personal commitments around accessing IVF simply because this ruling came down. And so the ruling definitely has an impact, not only on other states, as Jessie mentioned earlier, but also again at the federal level. Next slide, please, Kayla. So when we think about IVF at the federal level, we are looking, today it was breaking news that there is going to be an upcoming vote on the right to IVF bill on the Senate in 2 weeks. So there's a very limited amount of working days left in this year's Congress, again, just 2 weeks. And so there's going to be a vote on the right to IVF bill. The right to IVF bill is a bill that's been introduced in both the Senate and the House, and I'll give you the numbers. In Senate is 4445. And in the House, it's HR 7056. And that's so folks can look up the bills and read what it does. And I'd like to provide a brief overview of this bill. What it does is that it establishes a statutory right for individuals to access IVF treatments and doctors to provide, and insurance companies to cover those procedures. It also authorizes the Department of Justice to file civil lawsuits to protect individuals' rights to receive IVF treatments. We also see that the bill would allow service members to freeze sperm or eggs prior to deployment to a combat zone or hazardous duty, and that fertility treatments should be made more affordable by requiring employer-sponsored insurance and public insurance plans to cover them. So it's a very important bill that's up for a vote. We did see the same bill come up for a vote back in the summer, and it again did not pass. So we are seeing IVF continue to be an important part of the national conversation, as well as the conversation and dialogue ongoing in states. I did also want to say that, you know, in terms of education, service, and advocacy for IVF, NCJW is having a Jewish communal pledge for IVF access and religious freedom, because when we think about the Jewish framing of access to IVF, that the Jewish law is clear, because an embryo is not regarded as a person. And so the most common interpretation is that that life begins at birth. And then statistics also show that Jews in the United States disproportionately rely on IVF, with 17% of Jewish women utilizing fertility treatments to get pregnant, compared to 12.5% of the general population. So again, a very important framing for our work here. And that's why I'm again happy to be able to bring this all together and tie it in together. Okay, the next slide, please. Thank you. I wanted to end on a note of gratitude, thanking you all for tuning in this evening, and to my fellow panelists who bring a wealth of expertise, and just, it's also, I think it's always powerful to gather several speakers with a variety of expertise so that we can tie all all the different threads of what's happening in our country together. I wanted to thank the Jewish Fertility Foundation, especially AshLeigh, for all her patience in working through this, and the Jewish Women's Fund of Atlanta, and of course, NCJW for being incredibly supportive. And finally, but not least, advocates around our country and the world who continue this work at the local, state, national, and international levels. So I'll pause there. I don't have my email address up there, but I'm happy to share it after.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Thank you, Smriti. Thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and move on. We have Betsy Campbell, who comes to us from Resolve. She is the Chief Engagement Officer. Betsy, first of all, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And we're going to go ahead and share your slides so that you can focus on speaking and not on technical things here. So just
okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So how do we move forward in this post-Roe, post-Alabama environment? Well, that is exactly what Resolve is focused on, fighting for families and protecting access to care for the family building community. So next slide, please. Many of you are familiar with Resolve, I hope, but for those who are not, I want to share our mission statement on the next slide. So Resolve is dedicated to ensuring that all people challenged in their family building journey reach resolution through being empowered by knowledge, supported by community, united by advocacy, and inspired to act. And a big part of what we do is expanding and protecting access to care. And tonight we'll focus on protecting access to care post-Alabama. So next slide, please. So let's start with Alabama. Although we worked to restore IVF in the state earlier this year, as you heard from AshLeigh, our work is not done there because the status of embryos was not addressed in the immunity law that passed. And this issue is not going away. And it's not limited to Alabama. Unlike Vegas, what happened in Alabama does not stay in Alabama. It's the canary in the coal mine for the future of IVF and future efforts to regulate or outlaw this medical procedure, which accounts for approximately 2% of all U.S. births. IVF is the most successful treatment procedure, which is the most successful treatment available for infertility, with over 400,000 cycles in the U.S. performed annually. And after more than 40 years and more than 8 million IVF babies, it's facing its biggest threat yet. And it wasn't entirely unexpected. Next slide, please. As already noted, without the federal protection of Roe v. Wade, reproductive health care is now in the hands of state lawmakers, which we feared would open the door for each state to decide if and when to grant embryos and/or fetuses the same rights as children. Alabama was the first time our fears became reality. And now we are seeing a real appetite for regulating IVF, and in some cases, outlawing IVF at the state and federal level. Next slide, please. So Resolve has identified 16 states with legislative environments that are prone to personhood and anti-IVF legislation. Those 16 states are listed here, although this list will most likely change as nothing is certain in today's legislative climate. Next slide. And we know that well-funded national political groups are mobilizing to challenge the legality of IVF and define how IVF should be practiced. The Heritage Foundation, Susan B. Anthony, U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Southern Baptist Convention, and more have been very public about their intentions. Their goals include limiting the number of eggs retrieved, limiting the number of eggs fertilized, and requiring every fertilized egg be transferred. It shows a total lack of understanding about reproduction. They are calling it pro-life or ethical IVF, but it's actually unethical to practice medicine that way. It puts patients through unnecessary rounds of medications and invasive procedures. It'll prevent patients from getting the standard of care they deserve. It'll raise costs and risks for patients and result in poor pregnancy outcomes and ultimately reduce the availability of care. Next slide, please. And this is not just speculation. It actually happened in Italy when the Italian parliament passed a law in 2004 giving full personhood rights to the human embryo. Pregnancy rates went down, high-risk multiple pregnancies and births, that's twins, triplets, or more, went up, treatment costs went up, providers left the country, patients who could sought treatment in other countries. It took 10 years to reverse the law, and Italy still lags behind other European countries after the exodus of physicians and researchers. Next slide, please. So this is what happens when a religious lens is used to dictate the practice of medicine. A frozen embryo is not the same as a living child, and equating the two is scientifically inaccurate. The idea that life begins at conception is a religious belief. Conception is not a medical or scientific term. It's the religious basis for personhood and equating a fertilized egg with a child. A fertilized egg has the potential to become a human life, but in the overwhelming majority of situations, a human life will not result, whether the egg was fertilized in a lab or in the bedroom. Simply put, personhood is at odds with the science behind human reproduction, and personhood laws or court rulings threaten modern fertility care, as we saw in Alabama. Our laws and their interpretation should be rooted in evidence and scientific knowledge, not theological or religious beliefs. Next slide, please. So Resolve and our allies are actively working on legislation to protect IVF at the state and federal level. That's obviously easier in some states than others, and why federal legislation is so important. You just heard about the Access to Family Building Act, also called the Right to IVF Act. It's a current bill in Congress with more than 100 House and Senate sponsors, which would provide a national safeguard for IVF by creating a federal statutory right for patients to access evidence-based assisted reproductive health care and for doctors to provide it. We can't pass this legislation soon enough to avoid a potential domino effect from what happened in Alabama. No one should live in fear that their state or their hopes for a family will be next. Next slide, please. Fortunately, most Americans, 85% of adults, are in support of increasing access to fertility treatments, according to polling conducted by none other than Kellyanne Conway. That's an astonishing consensus in today's political climate, well beyond the 1 in 6 impacted by infertility. It's incumbent on all of us to reach out to our state and federal lawmakers and tell them they must put families first and fight to keep IVF legal. This issue is not going away. It won't be solved by the November elections, and it will take all of our voices, patients, providers, our families, and anyone who cares about family building to make sure that all people can access the medical care they need to build their families. Next slide, please. So Resolve's Fight for Families campaign is about harnessing this grassroots power, and we encourage everyone to join this pro-family movement. Now, I know I've sounded all doom and gloom, and I do want to stress that IVF is still legal in all 50 states, and everyone still has rights over their embryos and what happens to them. It's legal in Alabama, and it's legal in Louisiana, which has had a state law since 1986 that classifies embryos as juridical people, meaning they have the right to sue. As a result, it's standard practice in Louisiana for embryos to be stored out of state. We are not aware of any lawsuits where embryos have sued a clinic or intended parent. But as Jessie said, it's important for patients to have conversations with their providers about storing their frozen embryos, especially in states at risk of personhood legislation. Next slide, please. It's also important to note that personhood is nothing new. The first personhood ballot initiative was in 2008. And since then, Resolve has helped defeat more than 100 state personhood bills or ballot initiatives that could impact IVF. So we have a lot of experience fighting personhood, and we do this by mobilizing the family building community. People exactly like you who care about family building and want to keep all family building options available. It's also important to note that some states have specifically protected fertility services as part of their efforts to protect abortion and contraception. States with IVF protection laws include Illinois, Maryland, Minnesota, and New York. So again, opportunities exist to get involved no matter where you live. Next slide. In fact, it's imperative that you get involved. Now is the time for everyone to get to know their state lawmakers. Anyone can schedule a call or meeting with their state legislators, and share issues that are important to them. You are their constituent and they work for you. Share your family building story and that you want people to have access to the care they need to build their families. By having these conversations now, you are creating a relationship and letting your state lawmakers know that you're an expert on this issue. If a bill is introduced, it is much easier for you to reach out to your state lawmaker, remind them about your previous meeting, and state your position on the pending legislation. If you're comfortable, write op-eds and letters to the editor. Hardly a day goes by now without some article referencing IVF where you can share your perspective. At the very least, sign up for action alerts that Resolve sends you through the Resolve Advocacy Network and our Fight for Families campaign. And you can help spread awareness by sharing our social media posts. Public awareness is critical, so it's important to share factual information from trusted sources like Resolve and ASRM. We're in an unprecedented time in which the future of reproductive rights and access to IVF is uncertain. Threats to IVF and pregnancy care are not going away. This will be a long-term effort. We know that opponents of reproductive health care are very patient and believe in chipping away at access like they have done with abortion for the past 50 years. So this is our new normal, and we must all remain vigilant to ensure all people can access the full range of family building options, no matter what state they live in. So on the next slide, here's my contact information, and I believe we'll be taking questions, but please feel free to reach out to me anytime at Resolve.
Betsy, thank you so much. That also is just very, very, very fascinating to hear all the different, well, of course, how we can get involved, what we can do, and, just JFF we are ourselves not a political organization, but we obviously advocate through sharing education, and we're so glad that we were able to share all of this information with you tonight. So please feel free, if you do have more questions, please feel free to keep asking them on the Q&A function. So I'm just going to go ahead and just start a couple questions. AshLeigh, can you just kind of speak on what's the feeling in Alabama right now? Are people freaking out? Are they kind of in limbo, like are they comfortable but cautious? Are people moving embryos out of state? Are they kind of in a holding pattern? What is the feeling right now in Alabama?
So I'll be honest with you. I think a lot of the people in just the general public, they think there's no concern anymore. They think everything's good to go. That law was passed. IVF is fine. It's the people who are currently patients that are realizing the issue. I had a friend call me the other day where she said that her clinic was shipping her embryos out of state, which most of the clinics are. I actually spoke to a journalist about this thing and about this same issue, because he wanted to know, like, should they have thought about this when they made this immunity law, and should they have worried about this? And I was like, are you asking me if they should have legislated this? Because no, I think it's very smart for these clinics to ship these embryos out of state, because Alabama is coming after these patients. I think they're protecting their patients. That's what they're doing. They're being doctors. But the problem is the person who called me about her clinic shipping the embryos out of state, they were embryos that were not compatible with life. And she thought that they had been donated to science, but they can't do anything with those embryos. So she's now having to pay for embryos that were to be donated to science to be shipped out of state to a place that doesn't want to take any embryos to be donated to science. So now we're looking at patients now incurring additional costs, and they're transitioning the burden onto the patients when it's already an expensive process. And, I didn't even talk about my journey. My embryos are in Oregon because Alabama wasn't adequate. They didn't have adequate clinics to handle my journey. And my doctor even said, like, you should look for a place with a bigger lab. So I went to Oregon. My embryos are in Oregon. But then someone asked me, are you looking at transferring more? And I'm terrified to be pregnant in my state. So, I'm now pushing 40 and to think about transferring in this state when they care so little about women's bodies. I'm terrified. I don't want to be one of those women who has to wait until she's almost dying before I can get adequate medical care. Alabama is number 3 in maternal mortality rate. And when it comes to Black women, we're number 1. So, it was funny because Jessie uses the exact same terminology that I used, the trickle-down effect of our reproductive endocrinologists are leaving, our good OBGYNs are going to be leaving, and we're looking at more and more of a risk to women and to infants. So, the people who are in the know, we're not good. Everybody else, the general public, thinks that Band-Aid law fixed everything, and then they don't have to worry about it anymore.
That is just it's so scary. I mean, that was one of the things I was thinking about as doctors are choosing their specialties with this climate going on. Are we about to see a decline in reproductive endocrinologists because of this? And what does that mean for the future of infertility for people, for just the future, which is just frightening. So thank you so much, AshLeigh. Jessie, you had mentioned a survey that you had done with some of the doctors, and you had some of these responses that were fascinating to read. Has a recent survey been done to compare kind of, what things were, from the answers that you received, now what's going on? Has any of that changed from what the doctors were saying and what they're thinking or how they're behaving now?
Yeah, I mean, unsurprisingly, it was this sort of influx after the LePage decision. We had done a similar one after Dobbs, and then it sort of goes down after these sort of traumatic or seismic events. We're going to start circulating them again in October, and that is going to be one of the questions is, now that exactly what AshLeigh said, now that we have these Band-Aids, you know, have your patients been calmer, or not? You know, have your staff decided that they are safer or not? So I think we're going to be doing another round of those. And I will say, I think, you know, Smriti, you started with abortion, and that is so prescient because we know, looking in you know, the history of the past like 50 years, there are fewer and fewer abortion providers every medical cohort. And we're seeing those effects as well in the reproductive endocrinology field now that that's being criminalized. And so if we're looking at abortion as an indicator, you know, I think AshLeigh, you're exactly right, that it's going to be providers not wanting to retire because they know that there are no, you know, new folks coming in to take over their practices.
Nikki and Ilya, just curious, what, you know, because you had talked about your extra embryos and how you were able to get a wonderful response to your retrieval and the created embryos. Where are your embryos now, and kind of what are your thoughts on, you know, God willing, if you do want to have more children, what does that look like? What does that look like for you, for, you know, if you have to go through this again, living in Alabama versus, you know, having done your treatment here in Atlanta? What kind of thoughts do you have on, well, where are your embryos now, and are you planning on switching them back to Alabama if they are here in Georgia? And kind of what was the advice given to you at the time?
We do not want them anywhere near Alabama, so they're staying in Atlanta at our clinic now. And we do want more children, at least maybe one or two more. So hopefully we'll be back there in a few years using them for the next child, and they will be safe until then, I hope, thanks to all of these efforts, and Georgia being more sane than our own state.
And as AshLeigh said, even still, it's kind of scary to be a pregnant person in the state of Alabama. So it's,
yeah, we seriously discussed going to stay in a different state while I'm pregnant.
Yeah.
That was a discussion that was on the table.
My brother lives in Massachusetts, so it was, we had a very serious discussion about it. And for the time being decided that, well, I guess we'll risk it by having the pregnancy here in Alabama.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Smriti, as much as you can speak on, and again, I know it might be a bigger ended question, but has religious freedom been a major issue at NCJW with all of this kind of happening right now? What are you seeing from your perspective at NCJW?
So it is a very large question, and I won't go through, you know, all of the different threads, but I'll just give a shorter answer. First, you know, we advocate for all people, right? People of faith, people of no faith, people, whoever needs and wants access to a full spectrum of safe reproductive health care, including abortion access, including IVF access, all across the country. So in terms of this also being a religious issues, is that, you know, and we also saw this in Betsy's presentation about science, right? Science is so important. Science tells us, you know, science gives us the timelines, the scientific and accurate information that we need to make these decisions as we all think about our own reproductive health care. But faith also plays a role in the decision-making process. So when someone decides to you know, access IVF or access another form of reproductive health care, they're thinking about, you know, for example, the logistical aspect, right? They're thinking about finances. They're thinking about, can I take time off work? They're thinking about, do I have a healthcare provider or doctor or someone that I trust that can give me the right guidance? Can I go to my faith leader, or, you know, to the people I'm closest to, like my family? All of these various factors in making a decision. And so that's the framing of the work. But I think that when we think about religious freedom also, we're seeing this, and again, and we also saw this in Betsy's presentation, that the idea of enshrining the idea that life begins at conception into law all across the country is a very dangerous one. Because once that definition is there, it's enshrining one particular faith's viewpoint into law. And it means that everyone, no matter their faith, no matter no faith, whatever their decision-making processes, is negatively impacted by that enshrining of that one idea that life begins at conception into law. And that spills over into the very dangerous concepts that we saw this evening, like fetal personhood, just marching across our policy landscape in our post-Roe world. So I think religious freedom has definitely been a part of NCJW's work, but it's also about reproductive freedom, right? When we're thinking about that autonomy, personal autonomy, bodily autonomy, and when we're thinking about that decision-making process, that autonomy is paramount.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And, I know that, Betsy spoke a lot about, just the action items, things that we can do. We are so grateful to you for just giving us concrete ways. Obviously, we're here because we care about all of this, what's going on. And so it's nice to know that the things that we can actually do, aside from even just getting educated, there's unfortunately so much about this that people don't know. And so just thank you all for being here tonight, obviously, just for caring and for wanting to learn more about just everything that's going on. And so I, first of all, wanted to thank the Jewish Women's Fund of Atlanta, who is one of our partners, as well as the National Council of Jewish Women, and to our wonderful, wonderful, wonderful group of panelists. I can't thank you enough. This was so eye-opening in so many different ways, and I learned so much. I really hope all of you did as well. We will be having another in-person event, God willing, in beginning of December for anyone who is located here in Atlanta. And so stay tuned for more information. If there are any further questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I would be happy to be in touch with any of the panelists that spoke here tonight. Just another thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the panelists. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us.